Welcome to session 3.1, Managing Risks in ICT Projects and in Public-Private Partnerships. In this session, we'll look at what is risk, what are risks for PPP projects per se, what are risks for e-government PPP projects, how we manage and mitigate these risks, and how we manage IT projects. All of these issues are related. So what is risk? It's a factor, any factor in fact, that decreases the certainty of a desired outcome. It'll vary with the needs and circumstances of a project and is based on facts as well as perceptions of people and organizations. For a PPP project, risks are heightened as a result of the fact that the PPP model, in many cases, is still a new and untested one. Risk is higher in this case because there is little experience and few lessons have been learned and adapted to the situation in given countries. The greater the number of institutions in a system-wide IT project, for example, that's being implemented as a PPP, the greater the risk. So risk is definitely associated in this case with complexity. What about risks associated with e-government projects per se? These are influenced by the nature and complexity of the IT project, the scope of the project, the management of the project, how the implementation is to be carried out. IT projects carry a high risk in implementation. In some jurisdictions, only 18% success has been recorded in the implementation of 13,000 projects. What does risk mean? It means overruns, not meeting one's objectives, not staying within the time frame, or not delivering the desired output. Risks are also influenced by the cost of a project and the financing requirements. The more complex, the greater, the more uncertain the outcomes in terms of financing, the more difficult, and the more risks associated with the project. Trust is a big component that has a role in attenuating risk. We talked about perceptions earlier. Trust is a factor that affects perception and that directly influences the level of risk. The involvement of many actors, especially if they have not worked together in the past, that will increase risk. On the other hand, actors who are intimate partners and know each other on the basis of extensive experience, this may actually reduce risk. Risks are also influenced by the engagement of actors who have different ways of working. That's another way of saying that partners that work well together are more likely to be successful, and therefore there is less risk than those partners who don't know each other and who have different ways of working. Experience with working with the private sector, or conversely, experience of the private sector working with the public sector. And of course, experience in managing and implementing the PPP procurement process. There is novelty associated with in the partnership between the public sector and private sector. More experience one has in working with or consulting and engaging with the private or public sectors is going to have a distinct influence in the risk of the project, actual and perceived risk, as it turns out. The experience of the private sector itself in running a PPP will also have an influence on the outcome of the project. To give you an idea of the risks associated with the project, with an ICT project, let us look at the steps that can be considered, in some cases are considered, in implementing ICT projects. And as I said previously, the more complex, i.e. the greater the number of steps, the more likely a particular project may well have of not succeeding, i.e. the greater the risk associated with that project. So we look at this particular case. This is a project Gantt chart, which is a chart that lists a time sequence on the horizontal axis versus the actual tasks, their duration start, finish date, and in some cases we can add several other columns including responsibility and so on. In this particular case, the IDSC is a development support program that is being implemented for a cabinet of ministers. The project involves planning and design, so developing the business case, doing an analysis of the project planning, life cycle management, execution, This is a second page of the same project Gantt chart. Planning and design and results-based analysis, assessment of the readiness of the entity that's going to be responsible for managing and implementing the project, and so on. There's a whole series of different steps that account in part for the complexity of IT project implementation, especially when the IT project involves the automation of a business process in the public service, which is one of the main areas of e-government that we're, of course, concerned with. E-government PPP risks are also distributed as follows. The government has risks that are related to the following. If civil servants have an insufficient understanding of the PPP process and of IT projects, and if they're concerned about their own job security as a result of implementing e-government, this will have a significant impact on any PPP project. It just adds to risk. If popular support is challenged as a result of a PPP project, that will add to risk. If politically influential parties are not supportive, the risk will increase exponentially. They may well see in a PPP project an opportunity to criticize, fairly or not, the government. Some people may consider PPP projects as a semi-disguised way of giving away public goods. For the public, there are some risks. There's a risk in the eyes of the public that the private sector operator of a public service under a PPP may end up owning the public service itself, and may, as a result, make it more difficult to be accessed in a reasonable way by the public sector, by the public itself, that is. A private sector operator may establish or be perceived to establish a monopoly over a public service. The operator may be perceived to be driven only by profit, not public good, and there may be a clash in values and perceptions. It may be irreconcilable in the eyes of some. It may be irreconcilable in fact. There may be concerns related to data security and access to privileged and private information. And these data security breaches, whereby personal information is inadvertently misplaced or shared or made public, are a serious risk and challenge to any e-government project. So how do we deal with these risks? How do we limit them, mitigate them, perhaps eliminate them? Indeed, risk management is a central component of any project in general, and PPPs in particular. So for that purpose, risk management procedures are required and have been put in place, actually. As a matter of fact, there's a whole area of study in terms of risk management, and there are various procedures that can be elicited in order to deal with the risk associated with the risk associated. At very early stages, risks must be identified. In other words, you start a PPP project, indeed when you start an e-government project, you may well start by identifying and defining the risks, trying to assess the importance, measuring the importance or potential impact of the risk, try to figure out how the risk can be allocated between the public and private parties with the view to mitigating and eliminating the risk to the greatest extent possible. You need to specifically look at those mitigation measures, and you need to look at the probabilities and costings associated with the various risks and mitigation steps that you want to put into place. One way of helping to identify and manage risk is to put in place a risk register, which is a list of the various risks and associated characterization in terms of the nature, the type, the value, how to measure it, how it can be mitigated and or eliminated. Following table looks at managing risk. We're looking at sample project preparation risks and some of the mitigation steps that can be taken. On the left-hand side, the various types of risks. That is the description of the risk, the type, whether it's of a commercial nature, it's going to affect the bottom line. Of political nature, it's going to affect the support of the political process and of the public in its implementation, and various ways of mitigating these risks under the heading of risk mitigation mechanisms. We won't go into any detail on this, save to look at these and study these more specifically. Some may apply to a greater or lesser extent to projects you may be called upon to implement. This is a third page of these commercial and political risks and how it might be possible to mitigate them. So risk is rendered more manageable by reducing uncertainty. A clear PPP policy and a legal framework that is well established in law are certainly a first step in trying to eliminate or mitigate risks that may appear, especially in the policy dimension. Operational guidelines and institutional mechanisms should exist for negotiating, overseeing, and implementing PPPs. If it's the first time a PPP is being implemented in your jurisdiction, these guidelines, mechanisms, and so on, other supporting measures may not exist. If the legal framework is not there, you may well have a significant problem in your hands. You may not be able to implement fully. So you have to identify these preconditions well before you engage into substantive negotiation, and well before you start assigning resources to a PPP. This is one of the first steps. You need to look at providing a reliable, transparent, equitable, and consistent public procurement process. If the public procurement process is not fair and equitable, or is not perceived to be fair and equitable, this will influence public perceptions in relationship to the PPP itself. It will add to risk. You might want to consider how to implement shared services and a common policy in IT project implementation. This will provide a firm framework, or a firmer framework, or a clearer framework for the implementation of the IT project in general, and specifically will facilitate its implementation as a PPP. There will be less argument about what standards to use, how a particular project will interface with others, because actually you're stipulating it should be first a shared project. You might also have to deal with issues related to interoperability. If you put in place those rules, regulations, and standards, that discussion will not necessarily have to take place when you actually put together the PPP. It's important to start by satisfying priority demands so that these can hopefully generate support and goodwill for the project in its PPP form. And specifically, you may want to, if you're looking at doing a PPP and you have the choice of selecting the types of PPPs you may want to launch, look at PPPs that are going to help deliver more rapidly and more efficiently public services that are in great demand, public services that you cannot offer at this time. Look for projects where the benefits are clearly understood by the public, clearly and easily understood by the public. Projects, for example, that enhance access to services at the local and community level through banks, telecoms operators, and so on. Services that deliver cash to the citizen are likely to be projects that are clearly understood. I am going to get money from my pension system more readily because of the PPP than otherwise. I won't have to wait 2 weeks. I'll only have to wait a day. That is a sort of message that people can clearly understand. That is a sort of advantage that people can definitely appreciate. And that is a sort of advantage that a project implemented, an ICT project, e-government project implemented as a PPP can deliver. And that type of advantage can make the difference between a winning and losing proposition, between public support and public denial of your project. Before deciding to go ahead, you need to take time to understand the project and the associated risks. Indeed, what we just spoke about in the previous slides are examples of the steps you need to take in order to understand the project and associated risks clearly. You must look at the needs of the project. What is the real proposition? What are you actually talking about doing? It might be useful and necessary indeed to undertake a feasibility study. You need to make clear that you understand the business case. You have to make clear the procurement plan that you need to put in place and the steps you need to realize your procurement plan. You need to assess the capacity of your partners, look at public risk, public support and resistance, and how you're going to overcome these risks and this resistance. You need to look at how you're going to reduce complexity. Start with simple projects. Avoid complex undertaking. Reduce uncertainty by working on projects that are understood or for which your partners have established and demonstrated experience. Don't start something completely innovative and new in which you or your partners have no experience. It's the recipe for sure disaster, and if it's done as a PPP and it does not succeed, it will jeopardize your capacity and the opportunities for undertaking projects as a PPP in the future. Look for easy wins. That's projects with limited perceived risks, projects that are easy to undertake. Look to work with institutions that are easy to work with. Look for projects that people clearly understand. Look for opportunities that deliver quick results. If you can do all of this, then you're likely to have a successful outcome, one that's going to meet not only the terms and objectives and specifications of your PPP agreement, but one that's going to actually also engage and deliver support from the public and enhance services to them as well. You need to consult with stakeholders, absolutely essential. You don't consult, you really increase risk because you never know what they're going to come back at you with. You need to inform government stakeholders and the public. A public awareness campaign may be necessary. You might need to engage with the media to make sure that they at least understand if they're not on side. Hopefully they will become on side when they've understood. You need to put in place a monitoring and evaluation framework with measurable objectives and outcomes and indicators. You need to identify, define, assess, measure, and track indicators of success, and to do so on an ongoing basis. You need to make sure that everybody concerned in the PPP understand the contractual terms and agree to share the risks. Indeed, in many cases when you establish a PPP, the government sector, the government side, and the private sector side will engage experts who focus only on structuring PPP agreements. Immaterial whether it's a PPP in the water, sanitation, electrical, power, or ICT sectors. So you need to arm yourselves with expertise that will help you to structure the project in the first instance and the contractual arrangement in particular so that everybody wins and there are no surprises when it comes time to implement. When it comes to managing IT projects, you need to be concerned about complexity and reducing risk. As I mentioned, IT projects that involve infrastructure, like for example, installing a fiber optic network, those are projects that are really engineering projects that are not so difficult to implement because the steps, the requirements, the materials are clearly understood and easy to measure and use. On the other hand, that's not necessarily the case. You need to ensure that there's the greatest interoperability possible in the ICT applications that you may be wanting to put in place. You need to adhere to open standards as much as possible. These will help to reduce costs and ensure longevity in the sense that as the technology is upgraded and develops, your application will be able, and the data that you are using that will be the subject or that will be used in the application can itself be used by future upgrades in the future. This is future-proofing your project in some respects. You need to avoid single-source applications that tie only to one vendor and which may or may not be open standard. If they're not, that's an added problem. A common approach to IT project management means projects easier to implement, track, manage, and follow up. So a common management approach and project management approach to IT projects needs to be put into place. And again, as I mentioned previously, Module 7 looks at project management. It is a clear proviso requirement that you understand project management and all of its steps and all of the steps involved in project management in order to securely, in order to reduce the risks associated with implementing IT projects in general, and especially when it involves undertaking them as a public-private partnership. Okay, you also need to look at, as I said, a common management approach. Some jurisdictions have developed what are called, in this particular case, one jurisdiction, the Government of Canada, has adopted what's known as the Common Solutions Framework. I mentioned in just over the past few slides that only 18% of 13,000 IT projects have been implemented successfully. The Government of Canada, faced with such statistics, created a Common Solutions Framework that focused specifically on IT project management, and as a result generated significant savings both in terms of productivity, increases ranging from between 10 to 100% in terms of project implementation. Defect and error rate reductions range from 45 to 100% as a result of adopting this framework, this Common Solutions Framework. Savings were realized, scheduling was improved, and the need to redo or repeat was dramatically reduced or eliminated in some cases. The standard approach to ID project management would involve, for example, in this case, standard approach to planning and control, putting in place planning and control measures, quality control measures, procurement needs to be standardized, risk management measures and change management measures need to be put in place. Managing the changes at the project level in the project cycle are important when implementing individual projects. Again, this is largely a project management concern, but it has highly significant bearing on the outcomes of IT projects in general and those that are undertaken as a PPP in particular. The approach of the Common Solutions Framework is characterized by the implementation of the putting in place of a project planning and design team in one instance. You need a technical team to deal with the technical components. You need to look at institutional best practices, and you may well want to discuss with your colleagues in different ministries, in the Ministry of Finance, what has worked well in the past, both in terms of IT project implementation and PPP procurement, if that is the case. You need to encourage and adopt shared services and a common data warehouse, simply because it renders life a lot easier and avoids duplication of effort and allows the establishment of a common approach and common procedures to be put in place when implementing projects. It also means that if these shared services and this common data warehouse are implemented as agreed upon standards before your project starts, then you don't have to discuss and renegotiate this. It's a fait accompli, it is a fact of the project that you have shared services, that there is a data warehouse, that there are standards of operation and interoperability that you can work with. And in conclusion, so as I mentioned, PPPs are still relatively new for many countries, and the risks need to be carefully identified in order for them to be appropriately managed. IT projects have a heightened risk of failure, and this needs to be taken into consideration. Avoid projects which have never been done before. Avoid projects which involve extensive coding to try to automate or workflow and business processes. It's likely that a package may exist in the private sector already in the marketplace that you may want to consider. You should take a look at it, and at the same time consider service providers who already have experience in implementing these types of applications. Risk management is a critical component in both procurement and implementation stages, as we've discussed. And risks need to be clearly identified, value that is measured as to financial impact, and the information shared. The allocation and structure of risks will impact on the choice of business models and the cost of financing. As a practical exercise for session 3.1, we recommend the following group discussion. We'd like you to break into smaller groups once again. Discuss your experience in managing ICT projects in light of what we just discussed. Risks, managing them, how to implement a common management framework. Does that exist? How have you dealt with these in the past? Which projects in your experience were successful and what made them successful? Conversely, where were the failures and what were the results or the reasons for these failures? Finally, record your observations, make some recommendations, and share these with your colleagues in a plenary discussion. That information will not only assist your instructor as to delivering the remaining sessions of this module, they will help you better understand the discussion that is and the learning experience that we are exposing you to.